When the Keltharian Defense Force faces annihilation against overwhelming Zephyrian invaders, their ancient warrior traditions crumble under advanced plasma weaponry. Just as Commander Thale prepares for his final stand, a mysterious escape pod crashes into their battlefield, releasing Sarah Martinez, a wisecracking human mechanic with jury-rigged armor and an attitude problem. What follows is an explosive reversal of fortune as this unlikely savior demonstrates why humans are the galaxy's most unpredictable wildcard, turning certain defeat into spectacular victory through sheer audacity, improvised tactics, and enough sarcasm to power a small ship. Commander Thale's 4 eyes swept across the smoking ruins of what had been the proudest military installation on Kelthar just 3 rotations ago. Now it looked like someone had fed their defense grid through a meat grinder, then decided the meat grinder wasn't doing a thorough enough job. The numbers were as beautiful as a funeral dirge. 93% casualties, shield generators running on fumes and prayers, mostly fumes, ammunition reserves that wouldn't fill a decent lunchbox. And yet, here stood the remaining 7% of his forces, still clutching their ceremonial blade staffs like they meant something against plasma cannons. "Sir," Lieutenant Brix approached with that particular walk that said, "I have terrible news and I'm really hoping you shoot the messenger. The outer perimeter has fallen, completely. The Zephyrians are advancing on all fronts." Thale's mandibles clicked in what passed for dark humor among his people. "Define advancing, Lieutenant. Are they walking, running, perhaps taking a leisurely stroll while picking their teeth with our bones? More like methodically steamrolling everything in sight, sir." Of course they were. The Zephyrians didn't do anything that wasn't methodical. They probably had a 17-step process for taking bathroom breaks. Their entire military doctrine could be summed up as, apply overwhelming force in precisely calculated increments until the enemy ceases to exist. It was effective, efficient, and about as inspiring as watching paint dry on a corpse. The Keltharian way was different. Had been different. Anyway, back when they had enough warriors left to actually have a way. For 3,000 years their military traditions had been built on honor, individual combat prowess, and the ancient belief that a warrior's spirit could overcome any technological advantage. Their ancestors had charged into battle with nothing but blade staffs and righteous fury, carving out an empire that spanned 12 systems. Their ancestors had never met the Zephyrians. "Sir," Brix continued, clearly determined to make this the worst possible day, "our remaining shield generators are showing cascade failures. Engineering estimates we have maybe 2 standard hours before complete collapse." 2 hours. Thale's people had a saying, honor in death is still honor. Right now that saying felt less like ancient wisdom and more like the kind of thing you muttered right before doing something spectacularly stupid. He looked at his remaining troops, scattered across the defensive positions like islands in an ocean of destruction. Each one stood at attention despite wounds that should have sent them to the medical bay days ago. Their blade staffs gleamed in the harsh light of burning equipment. They knew they were going to die. They knew it was hopeless, and not one of them had suggested retreat. Sometimes Thale really hated their culture. "The Zephyrians are requesting our surrender, sir," Brix added, holding up a communications device that crackled with static. "What are their terms?" "Complete capitulation, sir. Immediate disarmament. All military personnel to be processed for war crimes tribunals. Standard occupation protocols." Thale's laugh came out as a harsh bark. Standard occupation protocols. How delightfully standard. He gestured toward the approaching enemy lines, where row upon row of Zephyrian soldiers advanced with mechanical precision. "Look at them, Brix. Perfect formations, perfect timing, perfect execution of a perfectly planned assault." The Zephyrian forces were impressive, he had to admit. Their dark armor gleamed with integrated technology. Their weapons never seemed to run out of ammunition. Their vehicles moved in coordination that would have made a ballet dancer weep with envy. They were everything a modern military should be, professional, disciplined, and utterly without imagination. 2 hours, Thale repeated, watching as another section of their perimeter defenses exploded in a shower of sparks and disappointment. "Well, that's just enough time for a proper last stand. Alert all remaining units. We make our final defense here, at the command center." "Sir. With respect, that's suicide." "Lieutenant, everything we've done for the past 3 days has been suicide. We're just finally being honest about it." Thale raised his blade staff, its energy core flickering like a dying star. "But if we're going to die, we die as Keltharians, not on our knees begging for mercy from some committee-driven military machine." The countdown had begun. 2 hours until their shields failed completely. 2 hours until the Zephyrians finished their systematic destruction of everything his people had built. 2 hours until 3,000 years of warrior tradition ended with a whimper instead of a roar. Above them the sky was a canvas of smoke and falling debris. Below them the ground trembled with the approach of enemy heavy armor. Around them, the last remnants of Keltharian resistance prepared for a battle they couldn't win. It was, Thale reflected, a perfect day to die with honor. He just wished it didn't feel quite so much like giving up. 1 hour and 37 minutes into their countdown to oblivion, the sky decided to add insult to injury by catching fire. At first, Thale thought it was just another Zephyrian bombardment. The streak of flame cutting across the smoke-choked atmosphere looked familiar enough, but then his tactical display started making noises that suggested it was having some sort of electronic nervous breakdown. "Sir," Brix squinted at his scanner, tapping it like that would somehow make the readings less ridiculous. "I'm detecting an unidentified object. Small, single occupant, definitely not Zephyrian." "Not Zephyrian?" Thale's mandibles clicked. "Well, that's refreshingly different. What is it?" "Unknown, sir. But it's coming in fast and hot, and it's not slowing down." The object screamed across the battlefield like a comet with anger management issues. Both armies stopped shooting at each other long enough to track its trajectory, which was the first time in 3 days that the Zephyrians had deviated from their precious schedule. The fireball carved a brilliant orange arc through the perpetual twilight of battle smoke, trailing debris and what looked suspiciously like someone's laundry. It hit the ground in no man's land with all the grace of a drunk boulder, carving a furrow through the scorched earth that would have made a decent grave for a small moon. The impact sent shockwaves through both defensive lines, rattling equipment and probably a few teeth. Smoke billowed from the crash site, mixing with the existing atmospheric disaster to create visibility that could charitably be described as non-existent. For a long moment, nobody moved. The Zephyrians stood in their perfect formations, weapons trained on the smoking crater. The Keltharians crouched behind their failing barriers, equally ready to shoot whatever emerged. Even the automated defense turrets seemed confused, their tracking systems swiveling back and forth like mechanical dogs trying to decide which fire hydrant deserved their attention. Then the smoke cleared enough to reveal what was definitely an escape pod, though escape pod was being generous. It looked like someone had welded a shipping container to a rocket engine and hoped for the best. Scorch marks covered its hull in patterns that suggested its journey had been eventful. Dents and scrapes told a story of violent encounters with things that were probably not meant to be encountered violently. The hatch opened with a hiss and a clang that echoed across the silent battlefield. What emerged was not what anyone had expected. A bipedal creature stumbled out, shaking its head and spitting what were probably curse words in a language neither army recognized. It was smaller than a Keltharian, taller than a Zephyrian, with pale skin and hair the color of burnt copper. Its clothing was a patchwork of different materials that looked like they'd been assembled by someone who'd given up on matching colors sometime around the second cup of coffee. The creature looked around the battlefield, taking in the destroyed fortifications, the smoking craters, the two armies frozen in mutual bewilderment. Then it spoke, and its voice carried across the eerily quiet combat zone with perfect clarity. "Oh, fantastic. Just absolutely fantastic. I go from getting my cargo ship blown up by pirates to landing in the middle of some kind of alien war zone, because today clearly wasn't going badly enough already." Folly blinked all 4 eyes in sequence. The creature's tone was dismissive, annoyed even, as if stumbling into an active war zone was merely the latest in a series of minor inconveniences. The creature brushed dust off its strange clothing and continued talking, apparently to the universe in general. "Let me guess. Ancient grudges? Religious differences? Someone drew their borders with the wrong color crayon?" It gestured at the two armies with theatrical disgust. "Yeah, that's about right. Well, this should be fun." Both armies remained frozen, weapons still trained on this bizarre newcomer who seemed completely unimpressed by the fact that it was standing between two forces that had been trying to annihilate each other for days. Commander Thale made a command decision that would either go down in military history or get him court-martialed posthumously. He stepped out of cover and approached the strange creature, keeping his blade staff lowered but ready. Behind him he could hear Brix muttering prayers to various Keltharian deities, which was either touching or a complete waste of time depending on your theological perspective. "Unknown entity," Thal called out, using his most diplomatic tone. "Identify yourself and state your intentions." The creature turned toward him, and he got his first good look at its face. 2 eyes, positioned in what seemed like an inefficient forward-facing arrangement. A small protrusion that was probably a nose. A mouth that was currently twisted into an expression he couldn't interpret but somehow knew wasn't impressed. "Oh, wonderful." The welcoming committee, the creature's voice, carried that same dismissive tone. "Let me guess, you're the guy in charge of this whole mess?" She gestured at the battlefield with one of her upper limbs. "Because if so, I've got some notes." Thale's mandibles twitched. "Notes?" "Yeah, notes. Like, first off, your tactical positioning is absolutely terrible. You've got your heavy weapons bunched up in clusters that are basically screaming, 'Please blow me up first.' And don't get me started on your supply lines. I can see 3 different choke points from here that any halfway decent tactician would have targeted hours ago." The creature paused, looking across at the Zephyrian lines. "Though to be fair, your enemies aren't exactly military geniuses either. Look at them. Perfect formations, sure, but zero adaptability. They're moving like they're following a checklist. Step 1, advance in straight line. Step 2, shoot at obvious targets. Step 3, wonder why the locals are still fighting back." Thale found himself momentarily speechless. This unknown being had been on his planet for exactly 3 minutes and was critiquing both armies like a disappointed instructor reviewing training exercises. "I am Commander Thale of the Keltharian Defense Force," he managed. "You are?" "Sarah Martinez, professional fixer of things that shouldn't be broken but usually are." She brushed more dust off her clothing. "And before you ask, no, I'm not military. I'm a mechanic. Was a mechanic. Hard to say what I am now that my cargo ship got turned into scrap metal by some pirates with more firepower than sense." "A mechanic?" Thale's translation software was clearly struggling with the concept. "Yeah, you know, things break, I fix them. Ships, equipment, occasionally people's terrible life choices." Sarah looked around the battlefield again. "Speaking of which, you folks seem to have broken pretty much everything here. Want some help?" Brick stepped forward, his blade staff raised. "Commander, this could be a Zephyrian trick, some kind of infiltration unit." Sarah snorted, a sound that didn't translate well but somehow conveyed perfect disdain. "Right, because the logical way to infiltrate an enemy position is to crash land in a burning escape pod while making sarcastic comments about everyone's tactical incompetence." "You claim to be willing to help us?" Thale asked, still processing this bizarre conversation. "Despite having no military training or obligation to our cause?" "Look, Commander Thale." "Right, Thale. Here's the situation. I'm stranded on a planet where 2 armies are having the galaxy's most destructive temper tantrum. My choices are sit here and wait to become collateral damage, or do something useful while I figure out how to get off this rock." She shrugged. "I've never been good at sitting still." That's when the Zephyrians decided they'd had enough of this unprecedented pause in their precisely scheduled warfare. Plasma bolts began streaking across no man's land, forcing all 3 of them to dive for cover behind a conveniently placed piece of wreckage. "Well," Sarah said, pressing herself against the twisted metal as energy blasts scorched the air above their heads, "I guess that settles the alliance question. Hope you folks are ready for some seriously improvised tactics, because military protocol just officially went out the window." Thole looked at this strange creature who'd literally dropped from the sky into his hopeless battle and somehow made him feel like victory might be possible. "What did you have in mind?" Sarah Martinez had been fixing broken things for 15 years, which meant she had a professional appreciation for exactly how spectacularly things could break. And right now, she was looking at the most beautiful collection of broken military equipment she'd ever seen. "Okay, first things first," she said, army crawling between chunks of debris while plasma bolts continued to make the air above them uncomfortably warm. "I need to see what you're working with here. What's your heaviest remaining firepower?" Thale pointed toward a bunker where 3 Keltharian engineers huddled around what looked like a cannon that had seen better decades. "Plasma artillery, but it's been overheating after every 3rd shot." "Overheating?" Sarah repeated, already moving toward the position with the kind of confidence that suggested she either knew exactly what she was doing or was too stubborn to admit she didn't. "Let me guess. Your cooling system is designed for sustained fire, but you've been pushing it beyond specifications trying to keep up with the enemy bombardment." The senior engineer, a grizzled Keltharian named Tech Sergeant Voss, looked up as she approached. "The human is correct, but there's no way to increase cooling capacity without a complete system redesign." Sarah examined the weapon with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years making impossible repairs with inadequate parts. "Who said anything about redesigning? You've got a perfectly good coolant system. You're just using it wrong." What happened next would haunt Zelkarian engineers for generations. Sarah began dismantling their precious artillery piece with tools she'd apparently pulled from her pockets. She rerouted coolant lines, jury-rigged pressure valves using components from a destroyed communications array, and somehow convinced the weapon's targeting system to work with parts from a food preparation unit. "This is blasphemy," Voss whispered, watching her work. "Those components aren't designed to interface with military-grade systems." "Components don't know what they're designed for," Sarah replied, elbow deep in the weapon's guts. "They just know what works and what doesn't. And right now what works is keeping this thing cool enough to fire continuously for the next hour." She was right. The modified artillery piece began laying down suppressive fire that actually suppressed things, forcing the advancing Zelkarians to take cover for the first time in 3 days. But Sarah was just getting started. "Right. What else have you got that's not working properly?" she asked, surveying the battlefield like a mechanic pricing out repair jobs. The next hour was a masterclass in applied chaos theory. Sarah turned shield generator scraps into improvised explosive devices. She repurposed communications equipment into electromagnetic pulse emitters that scrambled Zelkarian targeting systems. She somehow convinced a water purification unit to generate toxic smokescreens by feeding it cleaning supplies and optimism. The Zelkarians, who had spent 3 days executing their flawless battle plan, suddenly found themselves facing weapons that shouldn't exist, firing ammunition that defied logic. Their tactical computers, trained on thousands of conventional warfare scenarios, began generating error messages that roughly translated to, "What the hell is happening over there?" "Their command post," Sarah observed, studying the enemy lines through a scope she'd cobbled together from 3 different broken devices. "See how it's positioned? Perfect sight lines, excellent defensive coverage, textbook placement." "Yes," Thale agreed. "Impregnable. Also completely predictable." Sarah grinned, an expression that made Thale suddenly nervous. "They followed the manual so perfectly that they put it in exactly the spot any competent engineer would choose if they wanted to bring down the whole structure with minimal effort." She pointed to a series of mining charges that had been abandoned when their original position was overrun. "Those are mining explosives, right? Designed to bring down rock formations?" "Yes, but they're too far from the command post to be effective." "Who said anything about moving them closer?" Sarah was already sketching modifications on a piece of debris with a burnt stick. "We don't take the explosives to the target, we take the target to the explosives." What followed was 15 minutes of Sarah doing things to mining charges that their manufacturers would have sued her for if they'd witnessed it. She rewired detonation systems, created chain reactions using abandoned ammunition, and somehow turned a 3-kilometer stretch of battlefield into the galaxy's most dangerous Rube Goldberg device. When she triggered the sequence, it started small. One mining charge, detonating in a carefully calculated spot, caused a structural collapse that shifted the entire geological foundation beneath the Zelkarian command post. That collapse triggered abandoned ammunition stores, which created secondary explosions, which destabilized more of the terrain, which sent the supposedly impregnable command center sliding into what was now a very deep and very permanent crater. The Zelkarian forces, who had been methodically advancing according to plan, suddenly found themselves without orders, without coordination, and without any idea how their invincible command post had just been swallowed by the planet itself. "How?" Thale asked, staring at the smoking hole where the enemy headquarters used to be. "Did you know that would work?" Sarah shrugged. "I didn't. But in my experience, when you don't know what you're doing, the best approach is to do it confidently and let physics sort out the details." For the first time in 3 days, Commander Thale smiled. These humans, he was beginning to suspect, might be the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they were completely unpredictable. And unpredictability, it turned out, was the one thing the Zelkarians hadn't planned for. Word of the humans' impossible victory spread through the Zelkarian ranks faster than plasma fire through paper armor. Within an hour, soldiers who had been preparing for honorable death were suddenly asking if maybe, just maybe, they might actually survive this mess. And Sarah Martinez, blissfully unaware that she was becoming a legend, was busy turning their desperate last stand into the galaxy's most educational demonstration of why you should never underestimate a cranky mechanic with access to military hardware. "Right," she announced, surveying the battlefield from their newly secured position. "Time for Phase 2 of Operation Make It Up as we go." "Phase 2? Thale asked, still processing the fact that there had been a Phase 1. "Counter-offensive. The Zelkarians are confused and disorganized. Perfect time to hit them while they're trying to figure out what just happened to their command structure. Sarah pointed toward a heavily fortified position where enemy forces had regrouped around what looked like a mobile weapons platform the size of a small building. That thing there? That's their heavy artillery. And judging by the way they're clustering around it like scared children, I'm betting it's also their backup command center. Lieutenant Brix studied the target through his scope. The approach is completely exposed. Any assault would be suicide. Good thing we're not assaulting it, Sarah replied with the kind of smile that made explosions nervous. We're going to steal it. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in why human military doctrine, if it could be called doctrine, was simultaneously brilliant and completely insane. Sarah led a strike team of volunteers on what she cheerfully described as the galaxy's most educational field trip, weaving through enemy lines with a route that defied every principle of tactical movement. Left here, she whispered into her improvised comm system as they belly-crawled through a drainage ditch that hadn't been on anyone's tactical map. And remember, if anyone starts shooting, don't shoot back. Just look confused and keep moving. Confusion is our best camouflage. This plan makes no sense, muttered Corporal Vec, one of the volunteers who was beginning to question his life choices. That's exactly why it'll work, Sarah replied. The Zephyrians have protocols for everything. Frontal assaults, flanking maneuvers, siege tactics, orbital bombardments, but they don't have a protocol for a small group of idiots doing something that shouldn't be possible. She was right, of course. The Zephyrian sentries they encountered were so baffled by the sight of enemy soldiers casually strolling through their supposedly secure perimeter that most of them forgot to raise an alarm. The few who did try to respond found their communications mysteriously jammed by devices Sarah had built from spare parts and stubborn determination. How are you doing that? Thale asked, watching her work some kind of electronic magic on a Zephyrian sensor array. Trade secret, Sarah replied, rewiring the sensor to report that everything was perfectly normal while they crawled past it. But the basic principle is that most security systems are designed to keep out people who understand how they work. If you approach them with complete ignorance and enough confidence, they get confused. The heavy weapons platform was a marvel of Zephyrian engineering, 60 meters of armored death dealer bristling with enough firepower to level a small city. Its crew of 30 technicians moved with mechanical precision, following procedures that had been refined over centuries of warfare. They never saw Sarah coming. Excuse me, she said, tapping the shift supervisor on the shoulder, but I think there's a problem with your main power coupling. The supervisor turned, saw an alien creature covered in dirt and holding tools that shouldn't exist, and experienced the kind of mental crash that happens when reality stops making sense. While he was rebooting his thought processes, Sarah was already inside the platform's control systems, doing things to their targeting computer that would have voided every warranty in the known galaxy. What is she doing? One of the Zephyrian technicians asked, watching Sarah's hands dance across controls with the confidence of someone who had never met a machine she couldn't convince to do her bidding. I think, said another, she's hacking our entire weapons grid using a toolkit made from kitchen appliances. By the time the Zephyrian crew realized what was happening, their own weapons platform had turned its guns on their support positions and begun systematically dismantling their carefully constructed defensive network. Sarah, meanwhile, was providing running commentary that somehow made mass destruction sound like a routine maintenance procedure. Targeting system recalibrated to prioritize actual threats instead of whatever this thing was programmed to shoot at. Power distribution optimized for continuous fire instead of these weird burst patterns. And, there we go. Your artillery position is now working for the good guys. The effect on Keltharian morale was immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who had been resigned to death were suddenly cheering as their enemies' own weapons began supporting their positions. The sight of Sarah casually operating Zephyrian technology while critiquing its design flaws was spreading through the ranks like wildfire. She just walked up to their most heavily defended position and took it over, one soldier told another. Didn't even bring a weapon, just tools and attitude. I heard she convinced their own computers to switch sides by explaining why their programming was inefficient. She's not even military. She's just some mechanic who crash-landed in the middle of our war and decided to fix it. Within hours, Sarah Martinez had gone from unknown crash survivor to the most famous human in Keltharian military history. Songs were being written. Legends were being born. And through it all, Sarah remained blissfully focused on the practical matter of turning impossible odds into manageable problems through the simple expedient of refusing to accept that anything was actually impossible. So, Thale asked, watching their newly captured heavy weapons platform systematically destroy what remained of the Zephyrian offensive capability. "What's Phase 3? Sarah grinned, that dangerous expression that had become the harbinger of enemy defeat. "Phase 3 is when we stop playing defense and start teaching these committee warfare specialists why you should never pick a fight with someone who fixes things for a living." The Zephyrians, it turned out, did not appreciate having their perfectly planned invasion turned into an educational seminar on the dangers of predictable tactics. Admiral Krath, commanding from his flagship in orbit, had watched his ground forces get systematically dismantled by what his intelligence reports described as one unhinged mechanic with abandonment issues and a complete disregard for proper military procedure. His response was exactly what Sarah had expected from a committee-driven military mind: overwhelming force applied with maximum prejudice. "Sir," Brix reported, studying readings that made his mandibles click with concern, "orbital sensors are detecting massive energy buildup from the Zephyrian fleet. They're preparing to glass the entire continent." Thala's 4 eyes went wide. "They're willing to destroy their own forces?" "Apparently," Sarah said, watching the sky begin to glow with the ominous light of charging orbital weapons. "Admiral Rigid thinking up there has decided that if he can't win according to plan, he'll just delete the problem." Classic middle management response to unexpected variables. The countdown was simple and terrifying. 30 minutes until orbital bombardment turned everything within 500 kilometers into a parking lot with delusions of grandeur. Every Keltharian instinct screamed for immediate evacuation, but Sarah was studying the enemy fleet through stolen sensor data with the focused intensity of someone pricing out a particularly challenging repair job. "There," she said, pointing at the largest vessel. "The command dreadnought. See how it's positioned at the center of their formation. Perfect coordination hub, maximum protection, textbook fleet positioning. Also completely unreachable," Thale pointed out. "Even if we had functional spacecraft, which we don't." "Who said anything about spacecraft?" Sarah's grin was becoming a recognized harbinger of impossible plans. "We've got something better. We've got their own shuttle." The Zephyrian shuttle she'd commandeered during the weapons platform raid was, in her professional opinion, a masterpiece of over-engineering. Every system had backup systems, every backup system had protocols, and every protocol had been designed by someone who'd never met a problem they couldn't solve with more bureaucracy. "This is suicide," Thal said as they prepared for launch, though he was buckling into the co-pilot seat anyway. "This is Tuesday," Sarah replied, her hands already dancing across controls she'd rewired to actually make sense. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We die horribly in the cold vacuum of space instead of getting vaporized by orbital bombardment. At least this way we'll get a nice view before the end." The flight up to the fleet was a masterclass in aggressive piloting techniques not covered in any manual. Sarah flew the shuttle like she was threading a needle while riding a roller coaster, weaving between defensive positions with moves that defied both physics and common sense. Zephyrian fighters tried to intercept them, but found themselves chasing a target that seemed to be making up flight patterns on the spot. "How are you doing that?" Thalay asked, gripping his seat as they corkscrewed between 2 dreadnoughts. "Trade secrets," Sarah replied, sliding them into the command ship's docking bay with all the subtlety of a guided missile. "But the basic principle is that most pilots fly like they're following traffic laws. If you fly like traffic laws are merely suggestions and gravity is more of a guideline, you become unpredictable." Admiral Krath was everything Sarah had expected from a Zephyrian military commander. Tall, imposing, with enough medals to open a small jewelry store. He stood in his command center surrounded by tactical displays that showed his fleet overwhelming superiority, his ground forces' strategic positions, and his orbital weapons charging sequences. What he hadn't expected was for his enemy to knock politely on his blast door and then walk in carrying a toolkit. "Admiral Krath, I presume?" Sarah said, examining the command center with professional interest.
"Nice setup. Very intimidating. Probably cost more than most planets' entire defense budgets."
Krath's mandibles clicked in confusion. "You are the human responsible for this disruption of proper military order." "Guilty as charged," Sarah replied, approaching his central command console with the confidence of someone who'd never met a machine she couldn't convince to behave. "Though I prefer to think of it as improving your tactical efficiency through applied chaos theory. You will surrender immediately, or I will activate the orbital bombardment sequence." Sarah looked at the activation controls, then at Krath, then back at the controls. "You know what? Go ahead, push the button." Krath, trained in thousands of combat scenarios, had never encountered an opponent who actively encouraged him to use his ultimate weapon. While he hesitated, trying to process this tactical impossibility, Sarah was already elbow-deep in his command systems. "The problem with automated fleet coordination," she explained conversationally while rewiring the Admiral's own computers, "is that if someone gets access to the central hub, they can convince every ship in your fleet that every other ship is the enemy." The chain reaction was beautiful in its simplicity. Krath's own coordination systems, now convinced that the fleet was under attack by hostile vessels that looked exactly like Zelkarian ships, began targeting everything within sensor range. The Admiral watched in horror as his perfectly organized armada started systematically destroying itself with military precision. The Zelkarian retreat was, in keeping with their military tradition, perfectly organized. Even while fleeing in complete confusion from their own weapons, they maintained proper formation protocols. It was, they reflected, probably the most orderly route in galactic military history. Admiral Krath's surviving ships limped away from Kelthar with the kind of disciplined urgency that suggested they were following Emergency Procedure 7 Alpha, strategic withdrawal, when reality stops making sense. Behind them, they left the scattered wreckage of what had been the most technologically advanced invasion fleet in their history, now reduced to expensive space debris by their own coordination systems. "Well," Sarah said, watching the enemy fleet disappear into hyperspace from the command ship's observation deck, "that was educational. Though I have to say, for a species that prides itself on military precision, they sure don't handle unexpected variables very well." Thal stood beside her, still processing what he'd witnessed. 3 days ago he'd been preparing for an honorable death with the last remnants of his forces. Now he was watching the most feared military power in this sector of the galaxy flee in terror from a mechanic who'd arrived in a burning escape pod with an attitude problem. "How?" he asked, the question that had been building for hours. "How did you know any of that would work?" Sarah shrugged, the gesture that had become her trademark response to impossible victories. "I didn't. That's kind of the point. You can't plan for every contingency, so sometimes the best strategy is to become the contingency no one planned for." The trip back to Kelthar was filled with reports that sounded like fantasy stories. The Zelkarian ground forces, suddenly without orbital support or clear orders, had surrendered en masse rather than face more of Sarah's incomprehensible tactics. The planetary defense grid, such as it was, had been restored using techniques that would probably void every engineering certification in known space. And Sarah Martinez, the hero of Kelthar, the terror of the Zelkarians, the mechanic who saved a world, was sitting in the shuttle's cargo bay, fixing a coffee maker she'd built from spare parts. "The planet wants to give you a medal," Thale informed her. "Oh, that's nice. Do they have good coffee here? You've just single-handedly saved our civilization from conquest. Surely that deserves some recognition." Sarah looked up from her improvised caffeine delivery system. "Commander, I fixed some broken equipment and pointed out that your enemies were following a predictable script. That's not heroism, that's basic problem-solving with a side of common sense." But she stayed. Despite having multiple opportunities to book passage off-world, despite offers of reward and recognition from a dozen different planets, Sarah Martinez decided that Kelthar's defense infrastructure needed work, and she was, after all, professional fixer of things that shouldn't be broken but usually were. 6 months later, Commander Thale found himself observing the most unconventional military training exercise in Keltharian history. Sarah stood in front of a group of engineers and junior officers, wearing the same patched clothing she'd arrived in, surrounded by a collection of equipment that looked like it had been assembled by someone with a severe allergy to instruction manuals. "Right," she was saying, gesturing at a defensive turret she'd apparently built from 3 different weapon systems and what looked like a food processor. "The key to effective improvisation is understanding that components don't care what they were originally designed for, they just care about whether you can convince them to work together." Tech Sergeant Koss raised his hand tentatively. "But the safety protocols are guidelines written by people who never had to fix anything while being shot at," Sarah interrupted. "Look, safety is important, but so is actually solving the problem in front of you. Sometimes you have to choose between following the manual and getting results." She demonstrated her point by showing them how to turn a communications array into an early warning system using parts from a broken atmospheric processor and sheer bloody-minded determination. "The problem with traditional military architecture," she continued, critiquing the rebuilt command center with professional disdain, "is that it's designed by people who think symmetry is more important than functionality. Why do you need that ceremonial spire? It's just asking to be hit by orbital bombardment." Thella smiled, watching his engineers frantically take notes on techniques that would horrify their instructors and revolutionize their effectiveness. Sarah Martinez might not be a traditional hero, but she was exactly what his people needed, someone who looked at impossible problems and saw interesting puzzles waiting to be solved, preferably with coffee and sarcasm.